They came in silence, certain of victory before a single shot was fired. Commander Thrax stood on the bridge of the Vothkar, flagship of the Thari Empire's Third Conquest Fleet, watching the blue and white marble of Earth's solar system spread across his view screen like a prize already won. Behind him, 200 warships stretched across the void in perfect formation, a tide of metal and fire that had broken 40 civilizations before this one. None of them had been Earth. None of them had needed to be. Thrax had read the reports. Humanity was fractured, squabbling, a species that fought itself more than it ever fought an enemy from beyond the stars. Conquering them, he believed, would be like stepping on an anthill. "Scan results, Commander," said his second, a wiry Thari officer named Kessick, his mandibles clicking with something like excitement. Minimal orbital defenses. No fleet presence beyond a handful of outdated vessels. Their largest weapons platforms appear to be decorative museum pieces. Thrax allowed himself a thin smile. As expected, a species that cannot agree on borders within its own world will not agree on how to defend it from beyond. But there was a flicker of data at the edge of the display that gave even the confident commander a moment's pause. A series of old transmissions, decades old by the dating stamps, broadcast on repeating loops across every frequency humanity used. Warnings, not threats of violence, but something stranger. Invitations to turn back, phrased with an eerie, unshakable calm. You are entering protected space. This is not a threat. It is a courtesy. Turn back now, and no harm will come to you. This is your only warning. Thrax laughed, and the sound echoed coldly across the bridge. They beg for our mercy before we have even drawn a blade. Shall I have it translated for the historical record, Commander? Kessick asked. It will make a fitting epitaph for their species. Save your data storage for the surrender footage, Thrax replied. Send the scout squadron ahead. I want eyes on every population center before we begin landing operations. 12 scout vessels broke from the main fleet, sleek and fast, their cloaking fields humming as they slipped toward the inner system. It was meant to be a formality, a final confirmation of the weakness Thari intelligence had promised. Thrax expected their return within the hour, loaded with imagery of crumbling cities and disorganized militaries ripe for the picking. The hour passed. Then another. Status of the scout squadron, Thrax said, his voice less certain now than it had been. Kessick's claws hovered over his console, a tremor in his usually steady hands. Commander, there is no signal, no wreckage, no distress beacon. They are simply gone. A murmur rippled across the bridge, the kind of murmur that arises when professional soldiers feel, for the first time, the cold breath of the unknown. 12 ships did not vanish. 12 ships were destroyed, or they were captured, or they fled. They did not simply cease to exist, leaving behind not even a debris field for the sensors to chew on. Thrax forced his composure back into place, straightening the ceremonial plating across his chest. A glitch in their sensor jamming technology. Nothing more. Continue with the landing operation. I want boots, or whatever passes for human boots, on 3 continents within the day. He did not notice, in his certainty, the way Kessick's eyes lingered a moment too long on the dark, empty space where 12 ships had simply stopped existing, swallowed by something that had not even announced itself. Far below, on a planet that spent 80 years pretending to be exactly as weak and divided as Thari intelligence believed, something old and patient finally began, very quietly, to wake up. The landing craft ascended through Earth's atmosphere in staggered waves, their hulls glowing faint amber from re-entry heat, their sensors painting a picture of a civilization just as fractured and unprepared as the reports had promised. Conventional military scrambled in visible disarray. Radio chatter spiked with confusion and panic. It was, Thrax thought as he watched the feed from orbit, exactly the chaos he had been promised. It was also, though he could not yet see it, exactly the chaos humanity wanted him to see. The first landing zone was a stretch of open farmland outside a mid-sized city, chosen by Thari planners specifically because it offered no natural defensive terrain, no fortifications, nothing but soft earth and open sky. 300 Thari soldiers descended in armored transports, weapons primed, expecting to meet disorganized local militia at best. They met nothing at all. The field was empty. The transports touched down without incident. Soldiers fanned out across the silent farmland, their sensors picking up no human presence for kilometers in any direction. It was eerie, this stillness, this absence where chaos and resistance should have been. Then the ground itself seemed to exhale. Soft humming filled the air, faint at first, then rising, not from any visible source, but from everywhere at once, as though the soil and the sky and the very atmosphere had been wired with intention. A shimmer rippled across the open field, and for one suspended heartbeat, the 300 soldiers of the first landing wave simply stopped moving, froze in mid-stride, weapons lowered by some force none of them had triggered, and none of them understood. When the shimmer faded, the soldiers were still standing, still breathing, still very much alive. But every weapon they carried had been rendered as inert as a child's toy in a quiet, synthesized voice, speaking flawless, unaccented Thari, a language no human should have ever needed to learn, echoed across the empty field. You are not in danger. You are not prisoners. Return to your ships. This was your second warning. Back on the Vothkar, Thrax received a report with a stillness that masked a growing, unfamiliar unease. 300 soldiers, disarmed without a single shot fired, without a single visible enemy, returned unharmed to their transports as though humanity were simply letting them leave, as though conquering Earth wasn't even a contest worth their full attention. It's a trick, Thrax said to his officers, his voice tight. Some form of advanced electronic warfare. Nothing more. We adjust our equipment shielding and try again with greater force and greater numbers. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a single unwelcome thought had taken root. What if this was never a fight humanity was afraid to have? Far below, in control rooms buried deep beneath mountains and oceans, hidden for generations beneath ordinary cities and quiet farmland, men and women who had spent their entire careers training for a day they hoped would never come watch the same footage with calm, focused eyes. They're not listening, said one young officer, watching Thrax's fleet hold his position in orbit undeterred. They're going to come back harder. An older officer beside her, hair silvered, eyes carrying the weight of decades of preparation, allowed herself a small, grim smile. Good. Let them. Her name was Commander Elena Vance, and she had been waiting for this day since before the young officer beside her had been born. Sound the alert, Vance said quietly. Full activation. It's time they learned what patient really means. The hum of the Vothkar's engines was the only sound on the bridge as Commander Thrax stared at the tactical display, replaying the disarming of his soldiers for the fourth time, searching for the trick, the weakness, the explanation that would let him dismiss what he'd seen. He found none, and that absence of explanation gnawed at him more than any visible threat ever could. Compile a report for the homeworld, he ordered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Advise them that human resistance, while unconventional, remains manageable. Keswick did not look up from his console. Commander, the scout squadron has still not been recovered. Sensor logs show no trace of conflict, no debris, no signal degradation. They were simply removed from existence, as cleanly as a hand wiping condensation from glass. Then they fled. Thrax snapped. Cowardice among scouts is hardly unprecedented. 12 ships, Commander, simultaneously, without a single transmission. Thrax said nothing, because there was nothing reasonable left to say. Instead, he turned to the broader tactical display, where a new transmission had just arrived, not garbled, not threatening, but calm in the same eerie, unhurried way as the warnings before it. This one, however, carried a face. A woman, perhaps 50 by human reckoning, silver-streaked hair pulled back, eyes steady as still water. Commander Thrax of the Thari 3rd Conquest Fleet, the woman said, her voice carrying easily through the bridge's translation systems, as though she had expected to be understood without effort. My name is Commander Elena Vance. I am authorized to speak on behalf of Earth's Unified Defense Command. You have ignored 2 warnings. I am extending a third and a final courtesy. Withdraw your fleet from this system within 24 hours, and no further harm will come to your people. This offer will not be repeated a 4th time. The bridge fell silent. Thrax's claws curled against the armrest of his command chair, fury and confusion warring for control of his expression. Unified Defense Command, he repeated bitterly. Your species is fractured into hundreds of competing nations. Commander Vance. Spare me this theater of unity. The woman's expression did not change, did not flicker with anger or insult. If anything, there was something almost like patience in her stillness, the patience of someone explaining a simple truth to a child who refused to understand it. You're right that we argue. We always have. We probably always will, she said. But there are some things humanity stopped arguing about a long time ago. One of them is this: nobody invades our home. You have 24 hours. Commander, I'd encourage you to use them wisely. The transmission ended, and Thrax sat in the heavy silence that followed, feeling, for the first time since he had taken command of the Third Conquest Fleet, the unfamiliar weight of being underestimated himself. Orders, Commander? Keswick asked carefully. Thrax's pride answered before his judgment could. Prepare the full invasion force. We will not be lectured by a species that cannot even agree on a single government. 24 hours from now, Commander Vance will be kneeling before me, or she will be dead. Those are her only two futures. Across the system, on a planet that has spent generations preparing for precisely this moment of arrogant refusal, the warning's expiration triggered exactly what its architects had always known it would. Nothing happened immediately. No fleets emerged. No defenses revealed themselves. 24 hours passed in total, deliberate silence. And that silence, more than any show of force, unsettled the Thari fleet more than they cared to admit. Soldiers who had conquered 40 worlds found themselves checking their weapons twice, glancing at empty corridors as though something might be watching from the shadows between the stars. When the deadline expired, Thrax gave the order himself, voice ringing across the fleet's comm channels. Begin the full assault. Every continent, every population center. Show them the cost of defiance. 200 warships surged forward in a formation built to overwhelm, built to break the will of any defender before the first true battle had even begun. It was the same formation that had crushed 40 worlds before this one, refined over centuries of conquest, a doctrine of overwhelming force meeting whatever scattered resistance an unprepared planet could muster. Earth's response was silence. Until it wasn't. The first sign came not as an attack, but as a disappearance. A full third of the Thari fleet's forward sensor array simply stopped transmitting, as though a hand had reached out across the void and gently closed a curtain across their eyes. Pilots reported their navigation systems flickering, recalibrating against coordinates that no longer matched the stars around them. Communication between ships grew patchy, then silent, then patchy again, not the chaotic noise of jamming, but something far more unsettling. Precise, surgical, controlled. Status report, Thrax barked, gripping his command chair as warning lights bloomed across his console. Half our long-range sensors are blind, Commander, Keswick reported, sweat beating along his carapace despite the climate control bridge. Ship-to-ship communication is degraded by 60%. We are flying half-blind into. The Vothkar shuddered. Not from impact. There had been no impact, no detected weapons fire, no visible enemy on any screen. But from something that felt impossibly, like the ship itself recognizing it had crossed into territory it was never meant to survive. On the planet below, in command centers carved from mountain rock and ocean floor, the engineers and officers who had spent their lives preparing for this exact moment watched their displays fill with 100 small, quiet victories. Sensor rays blinded, navigation scrambled, communication fractured, all without a single shot fired, all executed by systems that have been waiting patiently for decades. Their fleet commander still thinks this is a malfunction, said the young officer beside Commander Vance, watching the chaos unfold across the Thari formation. Vance's eyes remained steady on display, her expression unreadable. He'll understand soon enough. They always do, right before the part where they finally listen. She turned to her communications officer. Bring the planetary shield array to full readiness. And signal the fleet. It's time to show Commander Thrax what humanity's patience actually looks like. Far above, oblivious to the storm closing around him, Thrax pushed his fleet deeper into the system. He was certain he would conquer by nightfall, never once suspecting that every meter he advanced was a meter further into a trap that had been built, refined, and perfected across generations he would never live long enough to understand. The Thari fleet pressed forward through the outer system, blind in patches, deafen others, and still Commander Thrax refused to believe that the disorder spreading through his ships was anything more than malfunction and bad luck. Pride, it turned out, was a more stubborn affliction than any sensor failure. Status of the planetary approach, he demanded, watching Earth grow larger and closer on the one display still functioning with full clarity. 70% of the fleet has reached low orbit, Commander, Keswick answered, though his voice had lost the eager confidence it carried at the beginning of the campaign. No resistance detected. No fleet presence. No weapons fire. Then humanity has finally understood the futility of resistance, Thrax said, allowing himself, for the first time in hours, a flicker of relief. Order the remaining transports to begin ground deployment. We will have this world by morning. It was the order Commander Vance had been waiting for, far beneath the planet's surface, in control rooms that had monitored this exact moment through generations of quiet, careful preparation. A single command rippled outward across continents and oceans, not an attack order, but an awakening order, the kind that had been rehearsed so many times across so many decades that every system involved responded with the precision of a held breath finally released. The skies over Earth, which had appeared empty and undefended to every Thari sensor for the entire duration of the invasion, were not empty at all. They had simply been waiting, cloaked beneath technology that made even considerable Thari sensor suites believe in nothing but open air. The planetary shield ignited first, not a single dome of force, as Thari doctrine assumed all such defenses must be, but a layered lattice of fields stretching from the upper atmosphere down to ground level, humming into visibility like the world itself had decided, all at once, to wear armor openly for the first time. Thari transports descending toward population centers found their paths simply closed, deflected gently but unmistakably back toward orbit, their weapons fired dispersing harmlessly against barriers that hadn't existed an instant before. Status. I want a status report immediately. Thrax roared, watching transport after transport bounce uselessly off defenses his intelligence reports had insisted did not exist. Commander! The planet is shielded, Keswick said, disbelief cracking his composure entirely now. Full spectrum coverage. We have never encountered offensive technology of this caliber from any species, let alone one your reports described as primitive. The bridge lights flickered as a new presence registered on what remained of their sensors. Not a single fleet, but dozens of formations emerging from positions that defied explanation, hidden behind moons that should have shown no signs of military presence, concealed within asteroid fields that Thari long-range scans had dismissed as empty rock, even rising from beneath the planet's own oceans and vessels that had never once needed a surface in all the years of their construction. Humanity's fleet did not look like the disorganized, scattered defense force Thari intelligence had promised. It looked like something built across generations by a civilization that had decided, long ago, that the next time someone came to take their home by force, that mistake would only ever happen once. This is not possible, Thrax whispered, watching ship after ship resolve out of what should have been empty space. More vessels than his entire conquest fleet. Weapon systems humming with an energy signature his tactical computers couldn't even properly categorize. Commander Vance's voice returned to every channel across the Thari fleet. Calm as still water, carrying not triumph but something closer to weary sadness. Commander Thrax, you were given 3 warnings. You were given 24 hours. Every choice that led you here was yours. What happens next does not have to include casualties. Surrender your fleet, and your people return home alive. Thrax's jaw clenched, pride warring one final time against the mounting, undeniable evidence of his catastrophic miscalculation. We are the Thari Empire, he said, more to himself than to her. We do not surrender to children with hidden toys. Then I'm sorry, Vance said, and for the briefest moment, something that sounded almost like genuine regret colored her voice. Begin neutralization. Minimal casualties. Disable, don't destroy, wherever it's possible. What followed was not a battle, in any sense the Thari fleet recognized from 40 prior conquests. It was a demonstration. Precise, controlled, almost surgical in its restraint. Human vessels moved with a coordination that bordered on choreography, disabling propulsion systems, severing weapons arrays, herding the panicking Thari formation into pockets where resistance became not just futile but visibly, painfully pointless. Ships that tried to flee found their path gently but firmly blocked. Ships that found their weapons answered not with overwhelming retaliation, but with calculated, restrained countermeasures that disabled without destroying. It was, Thrax realized with mounting horror, a fleet that could have annihilated his entire force in minutes and had chosen, instead, to spend hours proving they didn't need to. "They're not trying to kill us," Keswick said quietly, watching his own ship's weapon systems go dark beneath a wave of targeted countermeasures. The crew unharmed but utterly disarmed. "Commander, I don't think they ever intended to kill us at all." Thrax stared at the display, watching the proud Third Conquest Fleet of the Thari Empire reduced to drifting, powerless hulks within the space of a single afternoon, not through annihilation, but through restraint so total and so absolute it felt like its own form of devastating message. The Voth-Car itself shuddered one final time as its weapon systems, its engines, and finally its command override all went dark beneath an invisible wave of human technology that had never once needed to fire a shot to prove its dominance. "Commander Thrax," Vance's voice returned, quieter now, almost gentle. "Your fleet is disabled. Your people are alive. That was always our preference. Prepare to be boarded. You, personally, will be coming with me." Thrax sat in the darkened silence of his own bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of an arrogance that had cost him an entire fleet and would soon cost him far more, and understood, for the first time since entering the system, exactly how completely he had misjudged the species he had come to conquer. The boarding party that came for Commander Thrax did not arrive with the violence he expected, nor the triumphant gloating he had braced himself to endure. They arrived in clean, efficient silence, for armored figures escorting him calmly from the wreckage of the Voth-Car into a transport shuttle that hummed with a quiet, confident power his own ships had never matched. He expected a cell. He expected interrogation, perhaps even execution, as an example to the rest of his shattered fleet. What he found instead, when the shuttle doors opened onto a vast, orbiting command station that had not appeared on a single Thari scan throughout the entire invasion, was Commander Elena Vance, standing alone in a quiet observation room, watching the same starfield he had once believed he would conquer. "Sit, Commander Thrax," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her own. "You've had a long day." Thrax remained standing, pride forcing his spine straight even in defeat. "Spare me your courtesies, human. Tell me how you intend to use me. A trophy for your propaganda? A bargaining chip against my empire?" Vance's expression carried no triumph, only a tired, measured patience that unsettled him more than anger would have. "Neither. I intend to send you home." The words landed strangely in the silence that followed, and Thrax found himself searching her face for the trick, the manipulation, the angle he was certain must exist beneath such an offer. He found none. "You destroyed my fleet," he said slowly. 200 warships, thousands of soldiers under my command. "And you intend simply to release me?" "Your fleet is disabled, not destroyed," Vance corrected gently. "Every soldier you brought into the system is alive. We made certain of that at considerable cost and considerable restraint, because killing was never our objective." She paused, letting that truth settle before continuing. "We don't want your empire's territory, Commander. We don't want your resources, your technology, or your submission. We want exactly what we asked for from the very first warning we sent. To be left alone, in peace, behind borders no one crosses uninvited." Thrax studied her, searching for propaganda, the conquest disguised as mercy that his entire culture had taught him to expect from any victorious power. No empire conquers, and then simply walks away from the conquered. "We didn't conquer you, Commander," Vance said. "We defended ourselves. There's a difference, even if your doctrine doesn't have a word for it." She gestured to the viewport, where the disabled hulks of his once proud fleet drifted in silence, surrounded by human vessels that had already begun the careful, methodical work of escorting them toward the system's edge. "Every ship you brought here will be returned to your people, disabled but reparable. Every soldier will go home. This was never a war we wanted to fight. It was simply one we refused to lose." "Why?" The question escaped him before pride could stop it. "Why show such restraint to an enemy who came to take everything from you?" Vance was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice carried the weight of something she had clearly explained or tried to explain Many times before in conversations Thrax knew nothing about, because we spent the early years of our history nearly destroying ourselves through exactly the kind of unrestrained violence you expected us to meet you with. We learned, slowly and at terrible cost, that strength without mercy isn't strength at all. It's just another kind of fear, wearing armor. She met his eyes directly. We built all of this. She gestured to the station, the fleet, the shield array still humming faintly across the planet below, not to conquer anyone, but so that we would never again have to choose between our safety and our values. You forced us to prove that today. We're not sorry that we won. We are sorry it had to come to this at all. Thrax sat, finally, the fight draining out of him in a way that felt less like defeat and more like a long overdue understanding settling into place. My empire will not believe this, he said quietly. They will see only a defeated commander offering excuses for failure. Then you'll need to make them believe it, Vance said, because the alternative is that your empire sends another fleet, and another, each one larger and angrier than the last, and each one ends exactly the way this one did, except with fewer warnings and less patience, because patience is not the same as endlessness. Commander, we have plenty of both, but not infinite amounts of either. She rose, crossed into a console near the viewport, and keyed in a sequence that brought a small data drive humming to life in her palm. This contains full sensor logs of today's engagement. Your fleet's approach, our defenses, the restraint we showed at every stage despite having more than sufficient force to simply annihilate you. Show your superiors. Let them see in full, undeniable detail exactly what awaits the next fleet that crosses this border. Thrax took the drive slowly, turning it over in his claws, feeling the weight of an entire empire's future resting in this single fragment of data. And if they ignore it, if they send a larger fleet regardless, certain that I exaggerated my defeat, or that your mercy was weakness rather than choice. Vance's expression hardened, just slightly, the first true edge he had seen in her since this conversation began. Then we will be patient with them too, Commander, for exactly as long as it takes them to understand. But I'd encourage your empire to learn this lesson the easy way, because we have generations of preparation behind every border we hold, and we are not running out of patience anytime soon. She extended a hand toward the shuttle bay beyond the observation room. Your transport is ready. Tell your empire what you witnessed today. Tell them the truth, Commander Thrax. Not the comfortable lie that will protect your pride, but the truth that might actually protect your people. As the shuttle carrying Thrax pulled away from the station, escorted by silent, watchful human vessels until it cleared the system's border, he found himself staring back at the blue and white world he had once dismissed as primitive and divided, and understanding, with the cold clarity of a soldier who had survived his own catastrophic misjudgment, that he had just witnessed something far more dangerous than any weapon his empire had ever built. He had witnessed a species that had turned patience itself into a kind of armor and mercy into a kind of warning. And he was returning home not with the conquest he had promised, but with a truth his empire's pride would almost certainly refuse to hear. The Thari High Council received Commander Thrax not as a survivor bearing a vital warning, but as a failure seeking to excuse himself, and the distinction between those two receptions would cost the empire more than any of its leadership could yet imagine. You lost an entire fleet, High Counselor Dratha said, his voice carrying particular contempt reserved for commanders who return alive from defeats their culture believed should have ended in death. 200 warships, thousands of soldiers, and you return not with an explanation of strategic failure, but with tales of mercy from a primitive species that should have been crushed within hours. Thrax stood before the council chamber. The data drive Vance had given him resting heavy in his hand, and felt the weight of an entire empire's arrogance pressing down on a truth they had already decided not to believe. Counselor, I have brought full sensor records of the engagement. Every claim I make is documented. Humanity's defenses are not primitive. They are the product of generations of preparation, hidden specifically to lure overconfident forces into. Enough. Drathus's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. You ask us to believe that a species incapable of unifying its own government somehow built defenses capable of disabling our most advanced fleet without a single fatality on either side? This is not strategy. Commander, this is the story of a coward seeking to disguise his own incompetence as humanity's invincibility. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled council, and Thrax felt the data drive grow heavier in his grip with every dismissive word, understanding with mounting horror that Vance's warning was already coming true exactly as she predicted. "Play the recordings and," Thrax said, his voice sharper now, carrying the desperate edge of a man trying to save lives the council had already decided weren't worth saving. "Watch with your own eyes what their fleet did to mine. Watch how they could have annihilated us and chose restraint instead. That restraint is not weakness. Counselor, it is a species so confident in its strength that it doesn't need to prove it through unnecessary slaughter." The council did eventually watch the recordings, but they watched with eyes already closed to the conclusion staring back at them, interpreting every demonstration of overwhelming, restrained force as confirmation of their own theories rather than a warning against them. "Clearly," said a younger counselor, eager to align himself with Drathus's contempt, "this mercy was simply an inability to achieve full lethality, a flaw in their weapon systems, not a deliberate choice." Thrax wanted to scream that this was precisely the misjudgment that had cost his fleet in the first place. That mistaking restraint for weakness was the exact arrogance Vance had warned him about, but the council had already moved past argument into decision, and decision, once made by Thari pride, rarely reversed course for the sake of a single commander's testimony. "We will send the 2nd and 4th Conquest fleets," Drathus announced, the matter settled before any further debate could occur. "Combined 450 warships under joint command. We will not repeat Commander Thrax's tactical errors. We will overwhelm their defenses with numbers as weak, divided force could never have provided." "Counselor, please," Thrax began, but Drathus's raised hand silenced him completely. "You have given your testimony, Commander. Your failure will be recorded, and your warnings will be noted." The dismissiveness in his tone made clear exactly how little weight that word carried. "Return to quarters. Your part in this matter has concluded." It had not concluded. Not for Thrax, and not for the 450 warships that departed the Thari homeworld 3 weeks later, confident in their overwhelming numbers, dismissive of a single commander's testimony that they had decided, collectively, to interpret as cowardice rather than warning. The result, when it came, arrived with a speed and totality that made Thrax's original defeat look almost gentle by comparison. Humanity, having watched the first invasion with the patient calculation of a species that understood exactly how empires like the Thari process warnings, had spent the intervening weeks not resting on their first victory, but preparing, refining, reinforcing, expanding defenses that had already proven more than sufficient, simply to ensure that overconfidence would never again find an opening. The combined 2nd and 4th Conquest fleets enter human space exactly as the first fleet had, confident, dismissive of warnings, certain that overwhelming numbers would succeed where restraint had failed. They found, instead, defenses that had grown rather than weakened, a fleet that had learned and adapted rather than simply repeated its prior tactics, and a Commander Vance whose patience, it turned out, was a renewable resource rather than a finite one. The engagement lasted less time than the first. The defeat was more total, and when the wreckage of 450 warships drifted to sable at the edge of human territory, Commander Vance's voice carried across what remained of Thari communications with the same calm, measured patience as before, though this time, beneath the calm, ran a current of genuine disappointment that no amount of restraint could fully hide. "You were warned twice by 2 different commanders, with full documentation of exactly what awaited you here," she said. "We do not enjoy this, Thari Empire. We take no pleasure in your losses. But we will defend this border for as long as we exist, against as many fleets as you are willing to sacrifice to your own pride. The only question left is how many more of your people need to suffer before that lesson finally lands." The recordings of the second larger, more total defeat returned to the Thari homeworld alongside survivors who could no longer be dismissed as cowards seeking excuses, because there were simply too many of them, all telling the same impossible, undeniable truth. And still, even then, pride proved a more stubborn enemy than any human defense fleet, because empires built on centuries of conquest rarely surrender their assumptions easily, even when those assumptions have already cost them, twice now, exactly the price patience and restraint had warned them they would pay. A third fleet was already in preparation before the wreckage of the second had finished drifting home. The third invasion was the largest the Thari Empire had ever assembled. 700 warships, the combined might of 3 additional conquest fleets, commanded personally by High Counselor Drathis himself, who had grown tired of subordinates returning with excuses and decided, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once witnessed his own theories fail, that his presence alone would guarantee the victory 2 prior commanders had somehow squandered. Thrax, stripped of rank but kept alive as a kind of bitter consultant whose warnings continued to be ignored even as events proved him true, watched the Third Fleet depart with a hollow, helpless feeling of a man watching a tragedy he had already seen play out twice before. "They will not listen," he told Keswick, who had remained loyal to him through his fall from command, "until the lesson is so total it can no longer be denied. And by then, how many more will have died for a counselor's pride?" The answer, when it came weeks later, was total in a way that finally broke through even Thari pride's considerable defenses. Humanity met the Third Fleet not merely with the defenses that had disabled 2 prior invasions, but with something new, a coordinated response that revealed defenses Thrax hadn't even known existed during his own catastrophic campaign, layers upon layers of preparation that made clear, with brutal finality, exactly how thoroughly generations of human patience had outpaced even the Thari Empire's capacity for escalation. The 700 warships did not simply lose. They were disassembled with precision that bordered on instructional, as though humanity had decided that this third lesson needed to be unmistakable enough that no commander, no counselor, no empire could ever again convince themselves that human restraint was anything other than absolute, deliberate choice. High Counselor Drathis himself was captured, disabled, and returned home, not executed, not humiliated beyond the simple, devastating fact of his defeat, because Commander Vance's mercy remained consistent and unwavering as her defenses had proven to be. 3 fleets, she told him, in the same observation room where she had once spoken to Thrax, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone who had hoped, against experience, that this conversation wouldn't need to happen a third time. Nearly 900 warships, thousands of soldiers who could have died and did not, because we have never wanted your deaths, Counselor, only your understanding. I am sending you home one final time, with one final warning, because I do not believe a 4th conversation will be necessary. It wasn't. The devastation of the Third Fleet, combined with the irrefutable testimony of a humiliated High Counselor who could no longer dismiss the evidence his own eyes had witnessed, finally accomplished what 2 prior defeats and 1 bitter, disgraced commander's warnings had failed to achieve. The Thari Empire, facing the total loss of nearly 1,000 warships across 3 escalating catastrophes, formally withdrew its claim to human space and began, for the first time in its long history of conquest, the humiliating process of surrender rather than retreat. The terms Commander Vance offered were, true to her word across every prior encounter, far more generous than any defeated empire had reason to expect. No reparations beyond the return of captured equipment, no demand for territory or resources, only a single binding condition, broadcast not just of the Thari Empire, but across every frequency humanity's expanding sensor network could reach, ensuring that the lesson traveled far beyond the borders where it had been taught. Humanity does not seek conquest, and we never have, the broadcast read, carried across the galaxy in the weeks and months that followed, retold and reinterpreted by 100 different species who had spent generations assuming humanity's apparent disunity made it an easy target. We seek only the peace that comes from being left alone behind borders we will defend with absolute, patient resolve. We do not start wars. We do not seek expansion. But we have spent generations preparing for the day someone mistook our patience for weakness, and we will spend however many more generations are necessary defending what we have built. Cross our borders uninvited, and you will find not chaos, but consequence. Humanity does not seek war, but if war comes, humanity does not forget, and humanity does not lose. The warning spread across known space far faster than any conquering fleet ever could have, carried not by force, but by the simple, undeniable weight of 3 documented catastrophes that no amount of imperial propaganda could fully obscure. Other empires, other civilizations who had quietly watched the Thari's escalating disasters from the safety of distant borders, began quietly revising their own intelligent assessments of the strange, fractured species that had somehow turned patience itself into the galaxy's most effective deterrent. Commander Thrax, watching the broadcast in the modest quarters he had been permitted to keep despite his disgrace, found himself thinking not of the Empire that had dismissed his warnings, but the quiet, unshakable calm in Vance's voice across every encounter he had witnessed. The calm of a species that had never needed to prove its strength through cruelty, because it had spent generations building strength precisely so cruelty would never be necessary. He thought, too, of Keswick's question on that first day, when 12 scout ships had simply vanished into a silence that should have been their first and only warning. What if this was never a fight humanity was afraid to have? It hadn't been. It had never been a fight humanity feared, because fear was never the foundation their defenses had been built upon. They had been built on something quieter and far more dangerous to anyone who mistook quiet for absence. Patience, refined across generations into something that could wait calmly and without complaint, for exactly as long as it took an arrogant galaxy to finally understand the difference between weakness and restraint. Centuries from that day, long after the Thari Empire had become a cautionary footnote taught to every young commander across 100 civilizations, the lesson endured precisely as Commander Vance had intended on the day she first extended mercy to a defeated, disbelieving commander named Thrax. Humanity did not seek war and never had, but across the quiet, patient borders of human space, an entire galaxy had finally learned not to mistake that peace for an invitation,